Hi, everybody. I want to welcome you to Scale Adventures. I have with me a very experienced business leader, Brad Feakes, president of the EstesGroup. I'm really grateful that you're here. I've been enjoying these calls, talking with business leaders like yourself. I'm just going to take a minute to share a little bit about what I've understood about what y'all do, and then feel free to add to that. So the EstesGroup that Brad is president of primarily do ERP services. So you can think of them as managed IT services. The focus is with manufacturing and distribution companies, and they have depth of experience in that space. We talked about some interesting stories that will come down the line. Brad, is there anything else at a high level you would want to say about the introduction?
Sure. So first, thanks for having me on. Great to be able to talk with other people and just talk shop about the field. In terms of the EstesGroup, we've been around for close to 20 years now. Started off as a consultancy doing implementation consulting. So working in enterprise resource planning systems on a very different end of the spectrum. Over time, our customers started asking us for services that we weren't offering, services that moved us much closer to a traditional managed IT service company. And as such, our focus over time has become increasingly targeted to the hosting of the ERP application in private cloud architectures, and then the provision of supporting services to make that work in terms of integrations, endpoint security, backup and disaster recovery, trying to take all the different IT related aspects of an ERP system and try to make those robust for our customers.
Got it. Can you just talk to us about maybe one or two common challenges or situations that clients come to you with? That's typically the initial part of how you all work with them.
Sure. So when we set up private cloud architectures to give companies a very specific place where they can host their architecture that's secure, segmented, and fully functional for their needs. I have one example where a customer called me up in a frantic state because they had their ERP system hosted by a local small data center, and their local on-premise data center had gotten hacked and ransomed. So the entire client base was under ransom. And they came to us basically saying, based on the ransom payment in a week, we will have our database back, but there's no way that we're going back to our current service provider. Can you have a place to stick that database in a week's time? So in that interim period, we put together an architecture to host their ERP system, installed the application, got all the database slots ready. And when the data actually came over, we went live and converted them over. So they had pretty much a week of downtime, paper-based work. And they came to us to try to provide a more robust and secure solution for them. So that's one way that we see customers coming to us. Another will be the classic, has more to do with staffing than infrastructure necessarily. Such and such administrator is retiring, and we can't find a suitable replacement in the market. So we need someone who can help us handle this architecture because we don't have any on-premise people do that. So we help them migrate to the cloud and then administer their application such that their end users can consume it just as they had before, but we fill in for that staffing gap. And then probably the third most common is the software hardware attrition, right? Hardware has your classic server 5-year life cycle. After a while, too many switches and it starts switching off. And when customers start approaching that replacement period, they start doing the on-prem versus cloud Pepsi taste challenge, I guess we call it. So they start kicking the tires on a cloud solution to us to say, is there value in getting rid of our on-premise data center and just moving the application straight to the cloud? I say those are normally the situations we find customers running into and why they approach us.
Got it. So I'm hearing both the migration to the cloud and also providing key talent and capability based on their needs. If we were to just take a step back, and I'm sure in your head, you have a visual or a sense of what are the stages companies typically would go through, right? Let's say the beginning is the migration to the cloud. What are some other things that teams should be looking at or companies should be looking at? In some sense, they may not even know what's possible, right?
That's a good question. So I would say the migration journey really starts at the selection phase when you're kicking the tires on what your options are. We have customers that come to us sometimes at a conference. I had this not too long ago where we explained the options to an ERP customer and they looked at us kind of wide-eyed and said, I didn't realize these options were present. And so for us, a lot of this early stages just has to do with educating on what your options are in terms of your classic. With many ERP systems, you have two poles. On one side, you have an on-premise installation of a proprietary license. And on the other end, you have a software as a service or like a subscription-based purely cloud hosted, non-accessible SaaS solution. And then in between, you have some varieties of private cloud, what we call infrastructure as a service, which is very much a hands-off activity. So if you are a customer and you have really solid IT staff and you say, we want to move it to the cloud, but we still want to manage it, you go with what we call infrastructure as a service, where the provider, us, provides the infrastructure, but the management of that infrastructure is something the customer takes over. Now, in cases where, like my example, where someone was retiring and you don't have those resources, we do what we call platform as a service, which is the infrastructure management plus the layer of application management on top of that. So at that early migration stage, you got to have an idea of what that endpoint is. What do I still want to control? What level of access do I want? Which areas of responsibility do I need to worry about? Do I have the staff to address that? Understanding those things early helps you guide to that perfect endpoint, because the perfect endpoint for one customer might be very different for another, depending on their needs and their expectations. One early step that's probably should really get noted is discovery. Many customers come to us not really knowing what's under the hood, and they need someone to help them open up the hood and discover all the moving pieces, because quite often you're not really moving just a application, you're moving an ecosystem. You're moving a hybrid cloud, which is the application and all of its integrations, which could be at one of many levels. So you need someone who can help you do that discovery period and just understand how big a lift this really is to get from a current state to something future. And understanding that complexity level can help you understand what a perfect future state is. I've had customers who've implemented, say, a SaaS solution only to realize that many of their existing integrations don't work well with SaaS. And now they're forced to rewrite in their entire ecosystem or major components of it, which is a timeline issue and a cost issue and a reliability. It increases the level of risk and variability. So knowing that at the early stage, just how complex a machine you have can help you drive it into the right garage door.
I think it's interesting that you were talking about this in terms of spectrums, right? So on-prem, a SaaS, maybe a hybrid in the middle, just the infrastructure, the platform. If you could give us a before-after picture, people can then have a sense of that tension between current reality and the desired future, right?
Sure. So I'll give you two examples, two different paths of migration. One is a path that I call the lift and shift migration. So we had a customer come to us. They had a tight timeline. They needed to get off of their on-premise infrastructure because of reliability issues. So that was where they're coming from, current state. They had reliability issues and they needed to get this thing off of that server in a hurry. So we did what we called a lift and shift migration, which basically you take an image or a full backup of your existing server architecture, and you take that image and you port that image to the cloud, and you re-image these cloud VMs. Essentially, you take these VMs that you spin up, and then you drop that image onto each of them so that your application server, your terminal server, your database servers literally look and feel a lot like where they came from. So in that case, you have a much shorter timeline. From a customer standpoint, it's very much an apples to apples. Logging into a VM that is your application server might look very similar to your original application server that was on premise, because you've taken over everything, the operating system and the database management system, all those same versions. So you're not doing version upgrades, you're not doing an application upgrade. The application is apples to apples. So that is one sense where least amount of variability and the least amount of opportunity for improvement. I'm laying a baseline and I'm just going to get what I had before, except it's going to be in the cloud, and that's going to eliminate some risks and problems, but I'm not going to have other risks like old server operating system versions or old application versions that are no longer under support. Those are all challenges that you'll have to face later. So you end up with a pretty large phase 2 activity quite often that is an optimization. Okay, I have to upgrade to the latest version of the Windows Server and the latest version of the ERP system. I need to fix some integrations that are old and hard-coded. A lot of that happens after the migration. So that's one scenario that I've seen a lot of customers go through. Now, the other is what I would call, as opposed to lift and shift, build from scratch. So in this case, you do a thorough review of the existing architecture. You spin up your new virtual machines, your app server, your terminal server, your database server. You install latest versions of your operating system and database management system on those devices. And then you install quite often an upgraded version of the application, and you start that integration process with all of your third parties, and you construct that hybrid cloud essentially one at a time. What this does is it gives you a much more prime time and cutting edge kind of server architecture. So the delta from old to new could be pretty significant. If you have performance increases, security increases, there are some other things that could, of course, come along with that. You can use this as an opportunity because you upgrade the application. What the ERP vendor now is providing you can now be leveraged by the customer in terms of lapsed support, right? ERP vendors have a cyclical support model. So if you fall a few years behind, your ability to get help is diminished. So I see a lot of customers gravitate to that and use that upgrade now as an opportunity to reinvest with the vendor and get some vendor support. So that creates a big future to past transition. So there's probably more change management you need to worry about there, because if a customer's used to a fat client desktop app and suddenly in the future they're suddenly on a web-only browser-based app, the transition functionally is ginormous there. So you really want to manage expectations there. So in that case, you have a bigger chance to make some big benefits, but also you could run into some change management pitfalls along the way.
This was not a question I had originally planned to ask, but I'm curious now. One model is essentially you port something from an offline world into an online space. Second is a chance to reimagine. In a past life, I worked with quite a few startups, and we used to always struggle with people. They would like the case, but then the actual reality of transition is always challenging. Just a little bit on the change management side, what have been the lessons from the trenches around making those kinds of changes? What are some principles, patterns you've noticed and observed?
Generally, you have the biggest resistance from the people who are most invested in the system. The length of time that they have invested in the old system will be consonant with the amount of resistance they may feel. It's really beneficial if you can try to find some baby step. What I've seen some folks do is have a hybrid model in the future where certain users retain the old desktop application, new users and users who are more change ready jump onto the web client version and slowly migrate the users to the web client from the server-based desktop version. Then eventually you can spin down that terminal server entirely, trying to avoid the brick wall effect. That's one thing that I see work well when we come up with some hybrid opportunities to break people up like that. It helps a lot. The other is just thorough communication. You want people to sound the alarm early and often. I don't want people sounding the alarm that we have a change management issue after we've already gone live. If management needs to be aware of these concerns early so that they can plan internally, this is how we're going to communicate to our team. This is how we're going to handle this change. I really believe that you cannot under-communicate in these kinds of situations.
What was interesting about what you communicated is the idea that maybe some are still with the old model, and then the newer ones with the new model, it maps to that adoption curve of any product behavior. You have the early adopters, you have the mid, and you have the people that perhaps jump on board. In this power of starting small, building quick wins, just connecting the dots on similar experiences on my side. I want to move to a slightly different topic, which is you essentially been on a very interesting journey. We talked about it a little bit, where you started and where you are now. It's been quite a lateral journey, if I may say so. Just at a high level, I wanted to have a two-part question. The first one is a little bit about how you ended up in the role that you have right now, perhaps putting you on the spot to summarize a longish journey. Then I wanted a few questions around building and growing companies. What have been your lessons there?
My journey personally was one from more of the application side. I came from a manufacturing company that was implementing an ERP system across all divisions. It was not a huge company, but reasonably large, like 600,000 or 800,000, broken out over 5 or 6 divisions. We were in the process of implementing an ERP system across the entire company. I got roped into one of the business units and moved up to corporate, became part of the corporate core team. I got obsessed with the idea of ERP implementation and how you pull that off across large organizations, create that kind of common model implementation mode while trying to keep the core competencies of each division and what makes each one special. It's always the dynamic that I had there. As that project began to wrap up, some of my old consultants came back to me and started posing the idea of me joining the consulting side of the world. Because we were a reasonably large company, I'd worked with a lot of consultants and gotten opinions as an end user of this works well, that doesn't, I like this technique. Why not try that now as a consultant and take the leap? When I joined the EstesGroup about 9 years ago now, from the EstesGroup, I started off as basically an application consultant and just stuck around and kept doing what I was doing. And as more opportunities came, took them on, and eventually got into a directorial role and then a VP, and then eventually got to be the position now where I am as president of the company. Because of that, I was climbing up a moving target. As I had noted earlier, was been a transition itself. My shift has been from a very application focused side of the business to much more of an infrastructural side of the business. And the interesting piece is the business models of a infrastructural service organization and a project-based functional consultancy are very different. It's been a shift in how do I tweak my original assumptions about how a business needs to run in order to address different kinds of services we're offering. Because not to get too in-depth, when you're selling managed services, you're trying always to find a subscription-based service. You're looking for long-term relationships with customers that you can provide them adequate value at a reasonable price and build relationships. And you build your company layer by layer, and each of those subscriptions is a layer in that construction. Whereas with consulting, it's much more peaks and valleys, much more of a project-based orientation. So you chase after this one project, implement that project. By the time you're done, if you've done your job right, you don't see those people again. They wave to you on the way out, and then you move on to another project. That's the nature of the project. It creates much more of a peaks and valley culture. You're up all night working on a project, and the next day you have nothing to do. That's a bit of an exaggeration. It's that kind of approach. Whereas in managed services, you're trying to build a consistent, repeatable process where you step into the world of the kinds of things that you've challenged. When you're a project guy, you're a professional firefighter. And to use the forest fire metaphor, you're more Smokey the Bear in the managed services world. You're raking out the underbrush to prevent a bad fire. It's much more maintenance oriented and proactive versus reactive. You're always trying to get in front of that because those are the best services you can offer, the ones your customer never sees you doing. It was really a mindset shift personally as I've been going along this journey.
One common thread with leaders as we've talked is very often the next level involves questioning some assumptions that worked well for a period of time. It's not so much that it was not working, it won't take you to the next level, or the terrain is different. The ability to challenge those assumptions and then explore has always been a hallmark of growth. One thing I'm picking up is that part of your growth journey has been just following your curiosity. Then the other part has been the willingness to take a step back and say, what does winning look like in this environment? When you think of growing a company, if you were to give advice to your younger self that was just starting off, what would be one or two things that you think that, hey, you know what, these things have served me?
The younger version of me would have been much more hungry to hit the home runs versus bunting someone to second. The idea of small accounts, small projects are often a good way to build an internal rapport and culture of simple success and build good vibes with your customers. A customer that needs a small service today might need a bigger service tomorrow. Pushing away work that fits your wheelhouse but isn't big enough can often be an inhibitor to growth long term. What I found is as I was more and more willing to knock off little service requests, I found those folks coming back now for larger asks. Don't always get yourself obsessed with the next big thing because there are a lot of good little things out there that you'll overlook if you're swinging for the fences every time you step up.
The sense I'm getting, it's almost like a portfolio where you want a large section of the portfolio are some of the smaller wins, some of the more consistent wins, and maybe a smaller sliver, some of bigger bets.
If you're working in an environment, especially in the ERP space, quite often ERP communities are surprisingly small. And you want to try and build good rapport within that community because if you delight one customer, they may not be the home run customer, but they may tell the home run customer about you. And if they're spreading good vibes about you within the community, that only builds. So we had one customer that we had a really good relationship. We went to a conference. We had several other customers come up to us and say, this guy over at this session was raving about you guys, so I had to come and say hi. And you realize the value of delighting your customers is exponential. That idea there of not looking too far ahead at the next win such that you'd fail to delight your existing customers. That's a real failure point. When we're successful in delighting our existing customers, we feel the repercussions of that.
I love that example that made it come alive. I have one last question as we go through this, which is you had an interesting take about the future of your category, the trends, and some of the ways of thinking about the whole cloud adoption. Talk to us a little bit about that sort of growth plans of the EstesGroup. Anything around the future direction that you're seeing?
I would say cloud is certainly an area of growth. All the industry pundits seem to be pointing to that. What was an interesting gamble at our point was as the pandemic was turning on, we made one of our big first pushes into cloud hosting as a primary service. There was a lot of risk, of course, because of the fear of retracting markets and such. And we experienced the opposite. We found that our growth period spiked exponentially. I was doing a little research about the Great Depression and discovered that of all things, Great Depression, of course, your classic time of the market market retracting, yet it wasn't retracting in all places equally. There were certain things like, take the refrigerator, this item that its growth spiked during the Great Depression, and coming out of the Great Depression, the refrigerator became a common household item. And I tried to think, why was that? There's obvious value in the refrigerator as an investment at the time due to the concerns, the greater kind of macroeconomic concerns. The refrigerator was, for me, this kind of great metaphor of the cloud, just solving a similar problem in terms of eliminating risk, recouping potential costs, eliminating some of the factors that could really harm you as an organization. I saw from a lot of our customers, we're coming to us with that same mindset is they may not be coming to us looking to slash costs. They're looking to eliminate risks that of a ransom attack is huge. On-premise servers are a likely target for a hacker. We've known lots of customers who've gone through that. We found that the cloud was in many ways like the refrigerator of the future. That for us was a fortuitous path that we happened to be providing that service at a time where the industry's desire for it for various reasons was on the incline.
The point you made about the fact that the recession can create tailwinds if you position your work well, and the metaphor of the refrigerator and the Great Depression was fantastic. It reminded me of this early interview of Steve Jobs, where he was asked, what's a computer? He said, it's like the bicycle for the mind. I feel when you brought that metaphor of what the refrigerator was in that season is a great sort of analogy to what the cloud space is over here. This is another message that has been coming through with a lot of the founders we've been talking to, which is that essentially it's not stagnant. Things are moving and you need to figure out how to ride a wave, right? That's another pattern that has been coming up in the last few interviews quite a few times. We've gone through a little bit about what your company's been doing, some of the work y'all have been doing, how you think about the cloud, your own journey, advice on growing a business, thinking about the recession. I want to thank you.
Thank you, Akshay, for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you.